Professor Wojczewski, thank you very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. How do you assess the evolution of populist theory in the field of international relations? What is the impact of far-right ideology on foreign policy beliefs and preferences?
Yeah, I mean, I think populism in international relations has been a very, very dynamic research field. I think in the past, if we look back, let's say 10 years or so, there was hardly any research on that. And within the last 5 or 6 years, numerous studies, books, edited volumes, and so on have been published on this research topic. So I think a lot has been achieved within a relatively short time period. So we also can see a growing theoretical pluralism. So basically different ways of conceptualizing populism. So as an ideology or as a style, political logic, strategy, and so on, and basically also different research agendas. So from more conventional analyses of the impact of populism on foreign policy preferences to the way in which populism affects foreign policy making, the style of foreign policy making, to basically foreign policy as a potential side for political mobilization, populist identity construction, also how, in a way, the international or how international relations, global governance, regional governance, and so on have contributed to the rise of populism. So it's a relatively diverse research agenda. That said, however, I would also say that there are certain limitations. And I think one of the main limitations is, especially in the context of international relations, that populism is still largely perceived as something very negative and dangerous. And to a certain extent, that is understandable because populism can pose certain risks and challenges for liberal democracy, especially if we look at the populist radical right. So I think it can be very destructive if we look at Trump and so on. But at the same time, I think there are also variants of populism that are actually no threat to liberal democracy and that can in many ways also strengthen liberal democracy. So I think there is a certain, you could say, establishment bias in populism IR research insofar as basically populists are basically seen as the kind of problem, while the establishment is basically the solution. I think, in very simple terms. So this kind of binary is, I think, problematic because populism can also, in a way, be a positive force. And that is, I think, also when we look at left-wing populism, be it Podemos, be it Bernie Sanders, and so on, I think they are offering a quite different political project compared to the populist radical right. I think that is one of the limitations. So basically that populism is per se seen as negative and dangerous. And I think here more, we should rather treat it as a more ambivalent phenomenon. That is one thing. The other thing is that there are still some kind of issues related to the distinction between populism and related phenomena such as authoritarianism, nationalism, and the radical right more generally. So quite often it is not clear, okay, where does populism end, so to say, and where basically the kind of other, whether you call it ideologies, discourses, and so on, start. So how can we, for example, distinguish between populism and radical right politics? And I think basically related to the second aspect of your question, so what is the impact of far-right ideology on foreign policy beliefs and preferences? I mean, that is what I analyzed in my most recent paper, in which I try to demonstrate that we should focus far more, to use Kasmuda's terminology, on the thick or the host ideology than the thin ideology of populism. So basically, if we want to understand the populist radical right, we should talk far less about populism and far more about the radical or the far right ideology, because that is ultimately far more important when it comes to foreign policy preferences, foreign policy beliefs, and so on. And I think when we look at far right ideology, I mean, the core aspect of far right ideology is this very strict belief in the natural order of inequalities. So that is, in a way, at the heart of far right ideology, and that influences or shapes basically also the far right's foreign policy outlook. So here, of course, a key element is ultranationalism, so a very distinct type of nationalism that basically believes that the nation is defined primarily in ethnocultural or racial terms, and that basically these different groups are basically struggling with each other. So it's a very conflictive, a very antagonistic worldview. It's this us versus them antagonism, basically. So one nation defined in ethnocultural or racial terms versus the others. So, and that of course also then leads to basically a very negative attitude towards regional and global governance institutions, opposition against universal norms. So basically, if you believe that if you believe in the primacy of national identities defined in ethnocultural and racial terms, you are also by that logic not believing in international or universal norms. And basically another aspect related to that is then, of course, also this very chauvinistic foreign policy outlook. I mean, so basically this ruthless assertion of a nation's interests, so America first, and so on. So basically always maximizing the nation's interests at the expense of basically the rights, concerns, and interests of others. There are, of course, other aspects to far-right ideology, but I think, and how it impacts on foreign policy, but I think ultranationalism is really the key. And populism research in international relations would definitely benefit from looking at the far right's nationalism in greater detail, because I would argue the far right's nationalism is far more important when it comes to foreign policy preferences than populism.
Right. How do you see the interplay between securitization and populism shaping the legitimacy of democratic institutions, especially when populist leaders present the establishment as a security threat? Could you elaborate on the role of moral and existential threats in populist securitization strategies, and how this might differ when targeting domestic versus foreign elites?
Yeah, so I think populist securitization, so basically in a way presenting the elites or the establishment as a security threat, can certainly delegitimize democratic institutions and also result in basically authoritarian tendencies and policies. I mean, Trump is here, of course, a very prominent example. So he employed this populist securitization strategy quite frequently, especially in his 2015, in his campaign in 2015 and 16. So basically presenting the elites, the establishment, as a security threat. However, I would say that populist securitization is not always bad. I mean, if we contrast Trump with Bernie Sanders, for example, I mean, Sanders also attacked the political establishment or the elites, but basically what he highlighted was the destructive and undemocratic impact of big donors, the billionaire class, and so on. So basically big corporations undermining a core principle of democracy, and that is political equality. So if you have basically big corporations and other very wealthy individuals who exercise substantially influence US politics through donations to the candidates and so on, this is basically harming US democracy. So he basically also in a way employed a populist securitization strategy, but in a quite different way. So what we can certainly say, however, is that populist securitization is certainly a quite good and promising strategy for a populist leader or populist party, because it in a way legitimizes them while it delegitimizes basically the establishment or the elites in a way, because they are presented as an existential threat. And the populist leader can then claim, you know, I'm basically standing up for you, I'm defending democracy, I'm defending your interests, I'm defending your concerns against this elite that basically is not representing you anymore.
Right. How do you assess the interplay between populism and nationalism, shaping future cooperation among populist radical right movements across borders, especially considering the inherently nationalist foundations? Could you elaborate on the challenges populist radical right actors face in building sustained transnational coalitions, given their nationalistic and often anti-globalist stances?
Yeah, I think populism, to a certain extent, can help the radical right, basically, when it comes to international cooperation, transnational networking, and so on, because basically it offers them a common enemy. it can be the bureaucrats, it can be the so-called globalist elites. So I think this is in a way helps the radical right to mitigate, national differences and national antagonisms. So what we can see is that the radical right, in particular in the United States, but also in Europe, they are all employing this globalist conspiracy theory, according to which there is this globalist elite that basically is disenfranchising the people. Basically, this is this aloof elite that is not basically caring about the common people and so on. Obviously, this conspiracy theory is not very new. It has been around for decades. In far-right discourses, it also has a clear anti-Semitic underpinning. So often globalists is basically just a code for Jews. So this is basically what the radical right tries to mobilize in order to establish some form of international cooperation. So basically having a common enemy is quite important. And populism, especially combined with this kind of, radical right nationalism, can offer this common enemy, be it the globalist elites, be it the bureaucrats, and so on. However, certainly nationalism partially complicates their international cooperation. So what we could say is they can, in a way, agree on what they oppose, but when it comes to finding a proper and comprehensive alternative, so when it comes to policy making, when it comes to making actual policy proposals, then usually the differences between the radical right basically emerge, and then basically it also tells us it's quite difficult for them to reach an agreement. I mean, the very fact that basically there are now 3 radical right fractions in the EU Parliament already shows that. I mean, so the radical right is not united. So I would say it's less about ideology. So there are far more ideological similarities and differences between the radical right in Europe. However, there are, of course, differences when it comes to national context, political style. So some radical right parties want to appear far more moderate. They also want to appeal to more moderate conservative voters. So if we look at the brothers of Italy, for example, or Rassemblement National, they are basically trying to, appear more moderate and basically reach out to more moderate voters. So they basically have partially tuned down some of their more radical rhetoric, while the Alternative for Germany, by contrast, is less concerned about that. So the Alternative for Germany is in many ways more radical, and that is also in its rhetoric, at least, and that's also why then, for example, Le Pen, Rassemblement National, and so on, do not want to be associated with the AfD, despite the fact that there are no real substantial ideological differences. So it's more about style and, basically this attempt to mainstream their parties, their views, and so on. So that is one problem here. So you have these kind of national antagonisms and national differences, and also in terms of different contexts, different political strategies and styles that they employ. And the second problem is, I would say, this chauvinistic nationalism. So if you basically say Germany first, France first, and so on, there is relatively limited room for cooperation, for making compromises, because it in a way suggests you're always trying to maximize your own interests and your own concerns. And that is also, when we look at Rassemblement National and AfD, what we can observe. So they offer 2 very different narratives when it comes to the EU. So basically, according to Rassemblement National, the EU is basically a project dominated by Germany. So basically, Germany is a hegemon and benefits from the EU, and basically the rest pays the price. So that is a kind of narrative that Le Pen quite often uses in her rhetoric, while the Alternative for Germany presents the exact opposite narrative. Basically, according to the Alternative for Germany, Germans are the stupid paymaster who basically pay for the other EU countries. So basically, Germans are at the receiving end. They are not benefiting from the EU. So you have a clear clash of narratives here. And that, I think, also partially then explains why they are not cooperating with each other, or why it is difficult for them to cooperate, because they have basically different narratives, different political mobilization strategies.
All right. What is the impact of effective narratives, such as fear, nostalgia, and moral superiority, within populist foreign policy discourses, and how these emotions shape international relations dynamics?
So I think these effective narratives are absolutely crucial when it comes to the discourses of the populist radical right. Because when we look at these discourses, be it Trump, be it the Alternative for Germany, and so on, they all in a way animate fear, anxiety, resentment. So it's about, loss of control. We are overrun by foreigners, or as Trump once put it, either we win this election or we will lose our country. So mobilizing these existential fears is absolutely crucial. However, and that is the interesting aspect, so in addition to these very negative emotions that the discourses of the populist radical right trigger, so fear, anxiety, and so on, it also basically tries to promise a better tomorrow, a better future. So you have these very conflicting emotions. So on the one hand, it's about mobilizing and animating fear, anxiety, and so on, these existential fears. But at the same time, there is also this promise, if we basically gain power, we will, bring back our sovereignty. We will make America great again. So this is, this kind of triggering positive emotions, hope, nostalgia, maybe the good old times. We will restore the nation state. We will basically reverse all these, multiculturalism, globalization, and so on. And then basically we will bring back order, identity, sovereignty, and so on. So you have these very conflicting effective narratives and quite different emotions that populist radical right discourses trigger. And I would argue that basically it is this combination of these very conflicting emotions and narratives that populist radical right discourses trigger that partially explains their appeal and success.
How does the foreign policy approach of far-right parties like AfD and NPD reflect broader trends in global far-right movements, particularly regarding their stance on supranational institutions like the EU? What factors contribute to the differences in foreign policy outlooks between populist radical right parties and extreme right parties? And how do these distinctions impact their real-world diplomatic strategies?
Yes, I think the Alternative for Germany as a populist radical right party is slightly less dogmatic and a bit less Eurosceptic than the extreme right NPD, so the National Democratic Party in Germany, a neo-Nazi party. So first of all, the Alternative for Germany does not demand Germany's immediate departure from the EU. So they are, of course, playing with this so-called Dexit, but basically that is not their explicit proposal. They are still saying, first of all, we want to try to reform the EU or maybe, kind of make some changes, but we are not calling for the immediate departure from the EU. So, and in a way that also partially can be explained by the fact that the Alternative for Germany's voter base is divided over EU membership. So basically 43% of AfD voters basically are in favor of a Dexit, but that also in a way shows, that many AfD voters are unsure about it, are uncertain about it. So basically, there is also, this is obviously something, a concern for the Alternative for Germany, that's what they take into account. So there is no clear majority for an immediate departure from the EU. So not among their own voters, but also when we look at the wider German electorate, basically we can also see that a clear majority of Germans opposes a Dexit. So here, obviously, it's also a bit about opportunism. So the Alternative for Germany does not want to, wants to play with this, kind of option, but it does not directly demand it right now. And at the same time, the Alternative for Germany also proposes in a way to reform the EU rather than completely abolishing it. So basically, the Alternative for Germany generally says we believe that a customs union and also free trade zone, some aspects of the common market, they actually should be retained. So we don't want to abolish them. So it is in a way, you could say there is, of course, it is a highly Eurosceptic party, but still, it regards certain aspects of the EU as beneficial and as something that should be retained. The NPD, by contrast, basically demands that Germany should immediately leave the European Union, and it also does not really provide any, could say, defense of the European Union. So the only basically aspect of European cooperation that the NPD propagates is to create this racist and xenophobic fortress Europe. So basically, Europe should, as the NPD calls it, remain basically the living space of white Europeans. And that is basically where different European states can cooperate with each other. So basically preventing mass migration and so on, maybe also shielding Europe from other so-called destructive foreign influences. So for example, the US hegemony and so on, but that's it. So when it comes to common market or customs union and so on, these are things that the NPD opposes, unlike the Alternative for Germany. So I think we can clearly see some difference here. And I think that also applies to other populist radical right parties in Europe. Most of them are trying to propagate less extreme positions. So they are basically trying to retain a certain ambivalence, so being extremely critical of the European Union, but not demanding an immediate departure and destruction. So I think, and that of course, they try to appeal to wider voter bases.
Right. What are the implications of securitization theory in the populist discourse of Donald Trump? In what ways does Trump's populist approach to othering differ from traditional forms of nationalism in US foreign policy?
Yeah, so I think when we look at Trump's campaign in 2015, I mean, it was quite interesting and quite striking. I mean, two things. First of all, that foreign policy played such a prominent role. That is quite unusual in US elections. And that Trump, in a way, made the entire Washington establishment a security threat. I mean, that is basically what he claimed. And one of his prominent quotes was, they have dragged us into foreign wars that have made us less safe. They have left our borders wide open at home, and they have shipped our jobs and wealth to other countries. And with they, Trump meant the Washington establishment. So basically, the Washington establishment becomes an existential security threat in Trump's rhetoric. And the difference between a populist mode of othering and a nationalist mode of othering is that in the case of populism, it's the elites, and often the elites of your own country that, so to say, become a security threat, not other states, immigrants, foreigners, and so on. Obviously, they also mattered in Trump's rhetoric. So basically, especially illegal immigrants, China, and all these other nation states that supposedly rip the United States off through unfair trade treaties and so on. But what was quite striking in Trump's rhetoric was that he actually believed that one of the key threats to the American people can be located in Washington. So it's the US establishment. So the corrupt elites that in a way are not representing the American people anymore and so on. And by basically combining this, populist and national modes of othering, he could then in a way try to rally the people behind him. But at the same time, he also redefined what is American. So who is American? Who is part of the people? And in Trump's rhetoric, it becomes very clear that he primarily appeals to white Americans of European ancestry. So they are the real Americans. And they are in a way threatened by mass migration and so on. So, and through this basically mode of othering, he of course also in a way contested this bipartisan consensus on liberal internationalism in US foreign policy. So he basically claimed that is a problem. It is a kind of our flawed foreign policy pursued by our elites that is responsible for popular grievances, for all our problems and so on. And that is basically why that's why I should become the next president, so that I can change course and basically move away from this flawed foreign policy.
Right. How does the framing of the people versus the elite in left populist movements differ from that of right-wing populism, particularly in the context of foreign policy? How does left populism reconcile nationalist elements with international solidarity, particularly in areas like trade, immigration, and global governance? What do the cases of Bernie Sanders and Podemos tell us about the relationship between left-wing populism and foreign policy?
Yeah, so in my recent co-authored paper with my colleagues Emmy Eklund and Frank Stengel, we have basically shown that Bernie Sanders and Podemos offer a quite different conception of the people. So compared to the radical right, both in Europe and the United States. So when we look at the left-wing populist discourses of Bernie Sanders and Podemos, we can see that they are imagining the people as a relatively open, pluralist, heterogeneous group. So basically, in principle, everyone can become part of the people. So it's not closed, it is not essentialized, it is not in a way, this notion of the people is not grounded on certain ethnocultural or racial criteria. So that is a clear difference between left-wing populism and the populist radical right. So if you look at Trump and so on, you can clearly see there is this ethnocultural and racial element when it comes to defining the people. We can also see that in the case of Bernie Sanders and Podemos, they are decisively pro-immigrant. So what they are actually doing is because I think that is important to bear in mind, because when it comes to populism is so often associated with sentiments against immigration. But when we look at Bernie Sanders and Podemos, what they are actually doing is they are criticizing the establishment for securitizing migration. So, and I think it is also important, and I think I mentioned that in my first question, we should also adopt a more critical attitude towards establishment politics, because we can clearly see nativist and authoritarian tendencies in establishment politics. So it is not, the kind of the establishment is not the solution, and then there is this threat from the far left and the far right. I think that is a quite misleading binary. What Bernie Sanders and Podemos actually show is also that they are actually exposing the establishment's own authoritarianism and nativism when it comes to migration by adopting this clear pro-immigrant stance. And I think what Bernie Sanders does in particular is he in a way mobilizes this classical American narrative of the US as a nation of immigrants that basically has, this kind of moral and political responsibility to help others, to support others, also to let other people in so that they can pursue the American dream. I mean, he basically also highlighted, I'm a son of an immigrant, and basically that is what America is. It means solidarity, it means helping others, it means to be an open society that basically that everyone can join, instead of basically border fences and so on. At the same time, I think what is also interesting is we can see in the case of Podemos and Bernie Sanders that they criticize or attacked, this kind of flawed liberal internationalism. So especially Bernie Sanders basically said, it's liberal internationalism as envisioned by the US establishment is not the solution, because quite often it is just a disguise for a unilateral, militaristic and neo-imperialist foreign policy that has caused a lot of problems. Look at Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on. And basically for him, the alternative is quite simple: multilateralism and international solidarity. So again, we can see here, maybe also counterintuitively, because quite often populism is associated with isolationism, opposition against multilateral cooperation and institutions. For Bernie Sanders, as he put it, the cornerstone of his foreign policy would have been multilateralism. So working in a coalition, working with others, because he believed that there are so many global issues such as climate change, economic inequality, that no single state can address on its own. They require multilateral cooperation, and they require solidarity. So in this notion of solidarity, so basically that we should not, kind of just focus on ourselves. We should also basically show solidarity with others, help others beyond our own borders. That is something that he highlighted throughout his rhetoric. So of course, Podemos and Bernie Sanders, they don't want to do away with the nation state. They believe, well, there is at least for the time being no real alternative. But at the same time, they want to promote progressive change beyond their own polity. So that is what we can clearly see. And just the last point, so when it comes to the relationship between left-wing populism and foreign policy, I think what we can conclude is that there is no such thing as a populist foreign policy, because it really depends, what populism is, what kind of populism are we talking about, with what discourses and ideologies is populism combined with, and that can lead to very different foreign policy outlooks. It can lead to extreme nationalism and isolationism, and it can also lead to the exact opposite. And that is why we are basically in this paper quite critical of this notion of populist foreign policy, because it comes in so different forms that, such concept in a way that suggests a kind of commonality between radically different political actors such as Bernie Sanders and Trump is actually quite misleading.
Right. How has the Trumpian discourse use foreign policy in creating a platform for reproduction and consolidation of a populist nationalist electoral coalition.
Yeah, I think what Trump did, what was quite interesting, is he basically, his discourse went beyond this classical political cleavage, Republicans versus Democrats, but basically making it's the American people versus the Washington establishment. So that is basically was a key aspect of his discourse. And then he basically blamed a flawed foreign policy for poverty, unemployment, decaying public infrastructure, crime, and basically everything that is wrong in the United States. So that is quite interesting. So that foreign policy here becomes, in a way, a projection screen for societal problems. So it played a very, very prominent role in Trump's campaigns. I mean, I've mentioned that earlier on. So basically that he, in a way, blamed the US establishment and its foreign policy, kind of military interventions, free trade agreements for domestic problems in the United States. So that is, I think, the kind of, populist element. And he combined that then with a nationalist dimension. So because obviously he also scapegoated immigrants, minorities, and other nation states for US problems. So this is this kind of radical right nationalist element. And he, in a way, then combined these two modes of othering quite effectively in his discourse. And basically the populist mode of othering might, appeal to a slightly wider audience because it is, about its because these anti-establishment sentiments, might exist in different parts of the US society, while at the same time with this radical right nationalism, he of course also in particular appealed to white Americans, so rather than the US population as a whole. And basically what he did quite effectively was then to externalize America's problems. So in Trump's rhetoric, it appears, that the problems come from abroad. So they are either caused by the so-called globalist establishment that basically cares more about foreigners than about American people. It's caused about immigrants. It's caused by other nation states and so on. So that was, in a way, a quite effective discourse. So basically, projecting everything that is wrong on a flawed foreign policy and foreigners who are basically responsible for everything, for all our problems. And in a way, Trump tapped here into these quite well-established nativist discourses that have existed in the United States for centuries. So whenever there have been flows of mass migration, there was this kind of nativist backlash in the United States, where basically the so-called indigenous population basically mobilizes against the newcomers and presents them as a threat and so on. And that is basically also what Trump did. So basically, in a way, Trump's discourse is a reminder that this kind of notion of the United Nation of the United States as a civic community has been contested. So there has always been this kind of ethnocultural and racial construction of American identity, so that in a way coexisted with this more civic and pluralist American nationalism.
And lastly, there are those very concerned experts who argue that American democracy will not survive another Trump presidency. Others claim that these concerns are overblown and American democracy is resilient enough for another possible Trump administration. Where do you stand in this debate?
I think a very diplomatic answer would be I stand in the middle. I do believe that American democracy can survive another Trump presidency, most likely, but another Trump presidency will certainly severely damage US democracy and its key institutions. So I would say I think the reason why I'm not extremely pessimistic is that the United States is a consolidated liberal democracy with quite well-established democratic institutions, an active democratic civil society, and so on. I think that is certainly an advantage. I think democratic backsliding is more likely in societies in which democratic institutions are still underdeveloped, relatively new, and so on. I think the most extreme example is, of course, the Weimar Republic in Germany before the Nazis came to power. This is often called a democracy without Democrats, because basically you had an underdeveloped civil society, you had still, highly contested democratic institutions. So that in a way provided an environment in which Nazism or fascism could rise more easily compared to the United States. So I think that is one of the reasons why I'm a bit less pessimistic. But that said, I think Trump definitely poses a real threat or danger, not only to democratic institutions, but also to minorities and migrants who will be at the receiving end of his policies when we look at his anti-immigrant and racist rhetoric. So they will definitely be, so he is, of course, will certainly damage US democracy and pose a threat to certain sectors of US society. And I think the last point is, I think Trump, of course, contributes to and fuels this political polarization in the United States. And I think it makes it increasingly ungovernable because the US has this system of checks and balances. So there is, in a way, the need for different parties to cooperate with each other. And when you have this extremely high level of political polarization, that is not possible anymore. And the US becomes then increasingly ungovernable and dysfunctional. And potentially, Trump could then, through this, kind of political polarization, pave the way for an even more radical leader in the future who promises then to bring an end to this state of affairs, because the United States has become so ungovernable then basically that a maybe even more authoritarian leader might promise, I will bring back unity, order, and so on. So that is, I think, a real risk that I see for the future. I mean, the good thing is Trump is quite old, I think. So basically he has not that much time left to damage US democracy. So I think this will be his last term. We also need to look at his mental state in, let's say, 2 or 3 years. So that is, I think, also maybe a factor that might prevent damage to US democracy. So his age.
Okay. Professor Wojczewski, thank you so very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me and for your great questions.